Peter Guy. I build engines for a living. Originally from New Zealand, came over here in 1983. I worked for a company in New Zealand, similar to the old super shops we had here. And it was called Paint and Black. And they bought engine parts, race parts, took them back to New Zealand, and we built them up, sold them in our stores. And so in '83 I came over to buy up, stayed here for 6 weeks, was offered a few jobs, just through my general knowledge of engines and stuff from building engines in New Zealand. And so in '85 I came back on another buy-up and ended up staying over here and working. Originally I worked at PFM Turbo doing turbocharged racing engines and turbocharged pleasure boat motors. Got into boat racing. We won overall in the 1986 Catalina ski race, first boat overall in a 20-foot Shayada. And moved into Grand National racing. Got interested in that with Rudy Ramus from Racing Craft Boats and Bjorn Ailson, which everybody knows as Bounce. And together we maintained GN9, which was one of the famous boats that won a lot of championships and won a lot of races. From then got the itch, drove 9 a few times, and was building motors for Jim Blackmore with GN331, which ran a Chrysler Hemi, and I was building his Hemi motors. And we did pretty well. And so I ended up buying the boat from him and taking the naturally aspirated motor out and putting a blow-in motor in it. And ran that GN boat for about 10 years. Art Whipple in 2000 called me up and says, "Hey, I want you to come up and work for me." So I moved up from Orange County to Fresno, California, which is where I'm based right now. Did product development and prototyping for Art for about 3 years. Moved off to Pacific Marine, ran their engine department there, and ran the shop at Pacific Marine. Built Gibson Performances, Big Cat, built the motors for that and built the whole boat. I also did 43-foot Scarab with 2 identical motors to Gibson's. And we won the bridge to bridge in that. We won first to the island 2 years in a row in the Scope Poker Run with me driving. Both those boats ran 1100 horsepower motors running on 91 octane. And that's where I got my name, if you want, as far as building high horsepower pump gas motors. 200-hour high horsepower Whipple supercharged pump gas motors running on 91 octane. And we've got motors out there at 598 cubic inch making 1300 horsepower that'll run for 200 hours running 91 octane pump gas. Now that seems fairly normal nowadays, but back in 2003, 2004, 2005, that was pretty new to make that kind of power on 91 octane. Went to work for Semper Marine at his shop, managed his workshop for a while, doing performance boats, building eliminators and custom boats. The whole time doing my own race motors out of my own shop. Yeah, right now I still do boat motors. I do sandrail engines. I do custom fabrication. Do 4-wheel drive stuff. Car engines, drag engines, pretty much anything anyone wants, whether it's Ford, Chrysler, Chevrolet. I travel back to New Zealand still. I do jet boat motors for customers in New Zealand. The cost of parts nowadays, in the past 15 years, is just, it's gotten really good for Joe Blow customer. A set of rods nowadays, the cost of taking an old set of rods, magnafluxing, cleaning, shop peening, putting a new set of bolts in, resizing the top and bottom end, by the time you do all that, you have an old set of rods that you do not know the history on for about the same price that you can buy a new set of Chinese H-beams. Say Chinese, everyone goes like, oh, I don't know, but the Chinese rods are still 4340. They're made in China by people making 2 cents a day, but value for money on any kind of street motor, mild performance motor, they can't be beat. And you cannot refurbish an old set for the same price. Crankshafts, if you just want to take crankshaft and have it reground and it's just going to be a basically a budget rebuild. You're going to have a 280, 300 horsepower small block Chevrolet. The standard cast crank is fine. The other options are out there with some cast steel stuff that is only, by the time you get everything checked and cleaned and polished, you're probably only looking at $50 to $100 more to have a brand new cast steel crank. And from there you can go up to the forged steel, depending on the horsepower you want. So yes, you can use some of the old parts, but really look around and do your work. The whole idea of blueprinting a motor, or actually, there's two different things. People can assemble motors, a lot of people do it in their backyard, and some people do it very well. And then there's building a motor. When you actually build a motor, or blueprint a motor, it's putting all the right clearances in that motor. Everything to do with blueprinting is clearancing. As parts heat up, they expand. As the oil runs through the rod, you need to get that oil out. The oil is actually what cools the parts in the engine. So if you've got a motor that's turning 7,500, 8,000 RPM, you want extremely large clearances in the motor. On the rods, on a big block Chevrolet, 1,300 horsepower motor, you're probably going to be looking at 2.8 to 3 thou on the rods and 3 to 3.5 thou on the mains. You must get that oil out, which means a bigger fuel oil pump to keep the oil in there. If you've got just a street motor, 2 thou, 2.5 thou. So getting the right clearances in the motor, the right clearances in the pistons. If the pistons have too much clearance, they'll rattle. So if you've got an old wore out motor that you hone out and re-ring, it'll rattle its head off. If you have a later model motor with electronics and you have loose pistons, that sound will trigger the knock sensors and all the rest of it. Putting the right fasteners, the right quality parts, making sure that all parts that you put in aren't cracked. Spend the money, have some parts crack tested. Make sure the parts you're sticking in are good parts. Don't put some old stuff in to save $50 and end up costing yourself $5,000. The fasteners that you use on the motors that I use, ARP is the name in the industry. If you're going to put a small block Chev together, even a stock small block Chev, spend the $70 and put a set of ARP head bolts on it. Your cylinder heads will never leak. You'll be way happier. If you're going to put an old set of rods in it, make sure you put a set of new rod bolts in it. Just don't try and use up all the old stuff. The later model Chevrolet motors have torque to yield bolts. Once you tighten up that head bolt, LS motors are the same way. Every bolt in an LS motor is torque to yield. That means it's stretched to a point where it won't come back. So those bolts have to be all thrown away. You cannot take an LS or even a Vortec with torque to yield bolts and reuse those pieces. So go to IRP, look through their catalog, Summit, whichever, and find the part that you need and spend the money. If you keep that motor bolted together, it will stay together a long time. Compression makes cylinder pressure. For a certain amount of cylinder pressure will support a certain amount of, it takes a certain amount of octane to support it, which is the anti-knock value of the fuel. So down below 12 to 1, the differences aren't that great. Like a 9.5 to 1 motor, if you raise the compression up to 9 3/4 or even 10 to 1, that half a point is not worth that much. From 13 to 13.5 to 1, it's worth a lot. So if you're building a street motor with a small block Chevrolet 350 Chev on 91 octane with steel heads, you're looking about 9.5 to 1 is your max. But don't try for the max. You're way better off to be able to put the right amount of timing in the motor by having a little less compression, then bump the compression right up to the max, and when you have the right amount of timing in, you hear that little pinging sound, and then have to pull timing out of it. So you're not running your motor in the optimum, then the exhaust will start getting hotter because you're running retarded timing. So On the lower compression motors, leave yourself a little leeway. If you think you can support 9.6 to 1, then go 9.4. You're not going to notice it, but give yourself a leeway. And just remember, that little pinging sound is a sledgehammer hitting the top of the piston. That is the most destructive thing you can ever do to a motor, is detonate. You'll knock the top ring land out of the piston, you'll knock the head gaskets out of it. So when you're going down the road and you put your foot down and you hear that little ting, 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 ting sound, get off the gas. It takes about 10 seconds to destroy your motor. So everyone says, oh yeah, my motor's pinging a little bit. Remember it as a sledgehammer smashing the top of your piston. Buy a bulletproof block and a bulletproof crank and a bulletproof set of rods and a $1,000 set of pistons. If you're running a boat and you're running the motor between 4 and 5,500, 6,000 all day long pulling skiers, then you want a nice strong bottom end. If you're in a street car and you just want a daily driver, you got to get it's getting the air into the motor, through the intake, through the head, and out the exhaust. That's where all the power comes in. If you're only going to, if you can build a nice stock stout bottom end using factory parts or rebuilding your own parts, spend the money on the cylinder head, camshaft, intake. That's where you'll make the most power. You don't really have to worry about keeping a motor together that's only going to make 350, 370 horse, which would be a very stout street motor. You got to look at your intake system. Somewhere in that system there's a straw. If you put a nice big carburetor, a big intake, a nice set of heads, and a nice exhaust on it, and then you go cram a little low profile air cleaner on the top, there's your straw. You're sucking through a straw. You need at least 2 inches above a carburetor for it to work properly. The air has to have the ability to turn. That's a minimum of 2 inches. So when you have motors with drop down, very low hood clearance, and you've got that drop down air cleaner, don't worry about the big carburetor and the big intake, because that's going to be your restriction. So kind of try to balance everything out. Don't go out and spend $1,500 on an aluminum set of heads that are max ported, CNC'd, if you have limits like hood space. They've got to run a low profile intake manifold. Whatever is going to be your restriction is what you need to build to.